First Radio.
Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to Word First Radio, the podcast brought to you by Word First Ministries. I am your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, actually, no, not as always, because he's actually on vacation. So Cameron is not here. He's with his family up in Lillehammer. But today, I was joined by a really good friend of mine, or I consider him a really good friend, Mr. Bendik.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, excited about being here and sharing a little bit about myself with the listeners.
Yeah, exactly. So for those of you who don't know, we've been talking, we haven't really been talking about Bendik for very long, but I've known you for like how many years? A couple years now, I think?
I don't know, time flies, about a year and a half, 2.5 years, I'm not really sure.
Something like that. Bendik was one of the very first Norwegian friends I ever made here in Norway. And most recently, he's actually became one of our very first church members of the church that we planted here in Norway. So that's really exciting, and I know all about him, but I'm really excited to introduce you guys to him. So Bendik, go ahead, just get us kicked off here. Go ahead and just introduce yourself to the people back in California or wherever. Just who is Bendik?
Absolutely, I would love to. So the short story is that I was born and raised in a non-religious home, just a short distance outside of Oslo. Growing up, I always had a passion for learning and exploring, which is a passion that has taken me on many adventures, both traveling to see new countries, as well as exploring stories in books and movies. And I've always been curious, and being curious is a trait that I have very much taken with me into adult life, and it's something that has served me well.
Yeah, very cool. What's your favorite book series, basically?
Oh, I'm very fond of Harry Potter.
Yep.
I grew up reading them. It was the first book that I read entirely on my own. So they will always have a very special place in my heart.
Yeah, I tell you, anyone who wants to go see a movie in Oslo needs to just watch one in Bendik's living room for a change, because his home theater setup is it's tops. It's pretty great.
Well, it's nice of you to say that, but I mean, it doesn't beat a movie theater experience. I'll say that.
Sometimes it does with your friends, and you can talk sometimes. But yeah, very, very, very cool. So Bendik, tell us a little bit about your upbringing here, because obviously you're a member of our church and you're a Christian, right? As far as I know. So did you grow up in a Christian home? Tell us a little bit about how you were raised in that environment.
So yeah, I grew up, as I said, in a non-religious home, which doesn't mean it wasn't loving. We went on a lot of family vacations, had a lot of fun, and I've always had a good relationship to my mom and my dad and my sister. But church was never part of the picture. The only interactions I really had with church growing up was the short trips we made to the local church with my elementary and middle school. So you can say that my knowledge of church was very limited, and also limited to the Protestant church that you often find in Norway.
Yeah. So is that we've talked a little bit on the podcast about the state church, like the state Lutheran church? You're talking about those kinds of settings?
Yeah. So
okay.
that's the official, or at that time it was the official state church of Norway. Yeah.
Gotcha. So very liturgical, very traditional, if you will, and things like that. Not
absolutely. And to be honest, at that time it wasn't something I was looking forward to. It wasn't something that really excited me, and something that I could feel this is something for me.
Yeah. Interesting. So even though your family wasn't really religious, were you baptized as a baby, kind of like everybody else? Or
At the time I was born, everyone was baptized. I do believe that this was more of a thing you did out of habit and tradition rather than because your parents were necessarily believers. My mom always said that she, to some extent, still have her childhood faith.
Sure.
But then again, we never went to church, not even for holidays. And we never really spoke about religion growing up either.
Gotcha.
So it's something that I think most people born around my time happen to do, just because it was just the way you did it when you had kids back then.
Yeah. I think, like, would you say then, because you're the authority on this, I've only been here for a few years, right? So, like, I don't really know. I have suspicions, but would you say that that's like the typical Norwegian, like, upbringing as far as like their relationship with the Church of Norway? Like,
To some extent, yeah, I do know that this practice changed after I was born, not that long ago. When I was born, everyone was automatically signed into the church as a member at birth. If their parents were members or there was more circumstances, I'm not completely sure. However, that's not the case anymore.
Right.
And with Norway becoming more and more secular, I think it's less common for people to get baptized if their parents aren't necessarily strong believers, but
Sure.
I do still think it happens, but not necessarily to the same extent.
yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really enlightening because a lot of people, similar perspectives with like there's like different shades of like different perspectives. So I've had some people who would like answer that question I just asked with a straightforward yes, and other people who said, they add some nuance, kind of like you just did, and then other people who just like don't even think about it ever, think about the Norwegian baptism.
I guess it also depends a lot on what part of the country you grew up in.
Yeah.
Because just like in the US, you have sections or part of the country which has a high popularity of Christians.
Yeah.
And I grew up around Oslo, which from my experience, I would say have less less population of Christians than, let's say, one of the more southern places in Norway.
Yeah.
So in some way, you're also affected by what people around you do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very true. Speaking of that, I want to ask you about your story. I want to ask you about. So obviously something happened. You became a Christian, and it wasn't in the context of your family necessarily, as we just talked about your background. So what's the story there? Like, what happened in your life that made you get introduced to Christianity as you know it today?
So back in 2018, I moved to San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah.
To study. And one thing that caught my attention really quick was how big of a person's day-to-day life religion was to them.
Sure.
And this wasn't something I was used to back in Norway. I mean, taking for granted, I might not have been around that many Christians, but my idea wasn't that if you were a Christian, it was a big part of your life. It was just like something you didn't speak about.
Sure.
Which was
like that's private.
Yeah, that's private. That's not something you share with others.
Mm-hmm.
Which was then I experienced the opposite in Texas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very very cool. So you find yourself in Texas. You're studying and going to school. You find people that are more religious than you're used to in Norway.
Yeah.
I love that observation. So how did you get like connected to Christians there? Like, how did you get plugged into church while you were in Texas?
Yeah. So of nature, I've always been curious and truth-seeking. Although I consider myself open-minded, I see now, looking back, that I might not have been as open-minded as I think I was. Growing up, I always looked at religion as something out of date that has later been replaced by science, and Christian people as people who live in denial of what is true. However, my journey of moving to Texas took a surprising turn. So at my university, they did something called Tabling Tuesday.
Table in Tuesday?
No, Tabling Tuesday.
Tabling Tuesday. Okay.
So, which is where all the organizations and clubs on and around campus put up a table to introduce themselves. And while I was walking around the courtyard trying to see if there was anything that caught my attention, I got the attention of a guy named Austin, who later became a good friend of mine. He introduced himself and said he was part of a local church in the area, and he wanted to invite me to a social gathering they had every Thursday.
Nice.
But I was very open to him about me being a non-believer, and to be honest, that I thought Christianity was nothing more of a big scam.
A scam. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Like I said,
Yeah, I've heard that a few times, once or twice. Yeah.
But then again, he was still adamant that I should come and be part of the community of college students. So I decided to give it a chance, and I also decided for myself that, as I mentioned earlier, that my knowledge of religion that I've gained back in school in Norway was very much limited and mostly lost. So I decided to see, well, he seems like a great guy. Let's see if I can find some common ground between him and me, despite of our differences.
Sure. I'm really curious if you're willing to share what were those points of common ground between you and Austin. You said his name was. But,
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, I had the idea that Christians were very, not reserved, but very judgmental and, like I said, living in the past. So when he invited me to the social gathering, I was initially skeptical, but he was so adamant that I should go, but not in a pushing way, but in a very welcoming and loving way. So I decided to give it a chance. And even when I told them that, hey, I don't really have a car, so it would be difficult for me to get to your place, he said, oh, well, that's not really an issue at all. I'll have someone come pick you up. So there I am in a foreign country. I had been in the US before, but nevertheless, I'd never been in San Antonio before I moved there. And then I was going to have someone I didn't know come pick me up.
right, exactly.
And I can't say it didn't raise any red flags in my head. But the way I justified it to myself is that I was thinking, well, they're Christians. They're supposed to be good guys, right? So,
yeah.
can anything bad really happen?
Right. What's the worst that could happen, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's really,
exactly.
really funny.
But I'm glad I took the chance because I went and I had a lovely evening.
Yeah.
So growing up being skeptical and going from a point where everything needs to be documented by scientific proof, I did have a lot of questions, and I was lucky enough to be able to sit down with a girl who later became a good friend of mine and ask her all the burning questions I had, controversial questions. I guess in some ways you could say I was throwing literal rocks.
Right.
And looking back at it, I might have come off as harsh or overly critical, but I'm very thankful to her that she handled that with so much grace.
Yeah, absolutely.
And she wasn't judgmental towards me in any way. Right. Because I think if she had been, that would have put me off, but she responded to my questions with so much love that I realized that, well, we all might have our differences, but that doesn't mean we can't get along and build a meaningful friendship. And that's basically the beginning of how I started hanging out with that local church group of college students.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I love that. I love that kind of thing. I love, first of all, what I really love is your boldness. Your boldness to be like, yeah, well, I mean, if I'm looking into this, right, if I'm hanging around these Christians, right, like I'm going to see if it can hold up to, these things. And I mean, it's really, because a lot of people don't even do that. A lot of people, when they come up with like they come up with their reasons of why they're not a Christian. And sometimes it's because, maybe even a lot of the times, it's because of really good questions or really interesting, like pressing matters or things that they're really struggling with or wrestling with.
Absolutely. But then at the same point, I was in a foreign place where I didn't know anyone. I was thinking, well, I have to find community somewhere.
Sure.
And as far as I was thinking at the time, well, Christian people might not be the worst people to hang around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that, that I found interesting is that, very few actually take the first step, or at least the second step of like going and actually asking a Christian about these things, or going and asking someone about these questions. And you had people in your life kind of out of necessity, like you just said, being in a new place. And I just love that you were able to find people in your life.
Yeah, so me asking the questions at that time wasn't really me thinking I was seeking the Lord. It was more like me trying to understand what are those people like. Are those people someone I could see myself hanging out with? Just to see that we were on the same level as far as it came to values.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to see that despite our differences at the time, me being a non-believers and they being believers, we did share a lot of the same values. So yeah.
Yeah. So when did it go from just trying to find common ground, like you said earlier, trying to see that we have the same values? When did it turn from just like finding community and belonging to seeking the Lord and actually it becoming like a changing, meaningful thing in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to the weekly social gatherings for a while, and I really enjoyed getting to know more and more people. And it brought so much joy into my life. And because I wanted to get to know them better as we became friends, I asked them if I could come and join them for their weekly college church service. And of course, I was really welcome. And then again, they had someone come pick me up and drop me off afterwards. And I thought, well, even if I don't believe, that would be a great way to learn more about not them as persons, but what they believe and why it is so important to them. So when I first got to the church, keep in mind that my experience with church is limited to the church we went to with school as a kid. So to say I was blown away is more so correct. Because the church, so it was the non-denominational church. And how they did church wasn't even on my mind that, hey, it's possible to do church this way.
Sure.
So not only were like the pop songs catchy, and it would be songs that I would go like it appearing in my head for days afterwards.
Right.
But the sermons were more like lectures on specific topics rather than someone just standing up in front and reading parts of the Bible, which really helped me gain a better knowledge of the Bible, but also what the different verses means and what it means to live out that life in your daily life. So I kept going, and I still wasn't convinced, but the more I went and the more I heard, the more stuff I agree with. I could find myself agree with.
And so what was it that like really convinced you?
Yeah, so like as I mentioned earlier, I always want to seek answers, and I always had the opinion that unless there was overwhelming scientific evidence of Jesus being resurrected and performing miracles, it was all a big bluff. However, it wasn't until I watched a movie called A Case for Christ, which is an amazing movie, and which is a movie I would recommend everyone watch, or at least read the book if you're not a movie person like me. But yeah, it's a great movie and it's a great story. But some place in the movie, the guy in the movie hits me with something that made me think. He says that regardless of whether you choose to believe or not to believe, it all requires an action of faith. And then it also hit me that the way I went about it is that I required evidence that held up to today's standard, and you can't really ask for the same evidence for something that happened thousands of years ago that you can today. You can't see medical charts. You can't get that kind of information. So I realized that the way I had to go looking at it was more of is there overwhelming evidence that this happened rather than it did not. And for me, the evidence was overwhelming. And also, I think that paired with like how much I saw my life had improved just by changing the way I lived subconsciously by being around other Christians and subconsciously living a more Christian way of life. Really made me believe that there is something there, and the evidence is definitely overwhelming.
No, I mean, I love that. And the reason I love that is because it kind of combines a few things that I think are like really, really important. So this idea of like critically thinking through like the evidence and your beliefs and why we should believe what we believe and what our standards are for evidence, like what we consider good evidence and bad evidence. And it melds something I think is equally important. And sometimes in people's minds, it's more important, which is that this aspect of community, having people around you who walk the walk and not just talk the talk, not people who can just tell you this is a life-changing message, but can show you in their lives, this is how my life has changed because of it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's this saying that like actions speak louder than a word.
Exactly. Yeah.
Words, and I mean it's said a lot, but I also believe that it is true. And I do think community is important. Community is a big part of it. We call to live in community. So I think it's impossible, if not, I mean close to, if not impossible, to be a Christian and just live by yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I 110% agree. And speaking of that, you're so good at this. We didn't even talk about how we were going to transition from each topic, but that was just perfect. It's awesome, and I ruined it by pointing out how perfect it was. But anyways, so obviously you're not in San Antonio anymore. So what happened? So you became a Christian in San Antonio. I
Absolutely.
presume.
So, like everyone knows, in the beginning of 2020, something major happened.
Right, exactly.
And I had to see myself moving back to Norway.
Yeah. And help me out with that real quick, because I'm still not really sure. Was it Norway that said come back, or was it the U.S. that said leave?
No, so none of those things happened really.
Okay.
But I was in the US at a student visa, and there were talks about suspending flights from the US to Norway.
Okay.
And as an international student, you get some funding from the Norwegian state, but it wasn't enough for me to live in the US full-time year-round. And as an international student in the US, you are unfortunately not allowed to take work while you're there. So I had to go back for the summer and during Christmas break to earn money to afford to live there. And with the chances of flights being cancelled and not knowing if they would reopen for the summer, I had to go back, because if I didn't go back, I wouldn't have enough money to pay my bills, pay my rent, and the apartment complex was very adamant that, well, if you can't pay, we'll kick you out. So unfortunately, I didn't have any options then to go back to Norway.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that sounds like it was really hard. Really
And I mean, because at that point I'd been in Texas for almost 3 years. I'd left my life in Norway. I'd built a life in the US. All my friends and my friends that I became so close to that I consider them family was there. And being so far away from where you grow up, you sort of, not by action, but it's hard to keep touch with those people that you grew up with and people you know back in Norway.
Oh yeah.
So it was hard packing up and
coming back.
Yeah, and living, and on top of it all, I had to do that in less than a week. So it also really stressful doing that.
That sounds similar to a friend of ours recently. That you were. I mean, Bendik knows who Alan was, and we talked about that. But I mean, it was. Nothing like that has happened to me, but we got a little taste of that when it was happening to our friend Alan. And as we were helping him pack up his stuff in a week to get out of here, I mean, that's I couldn't imagine, man.
So it could really uproot your stability and your way of life, because all of a sudden you need to start over again. And at that time, moving back to Norway during the pandemic, I was still very fresh in my walk with Jesus, and it wasn't that long ago that I was baptized. And then I found myself doing this alone because I didn't have a church in Norway, and I did find that very, very difficult. I tried a few churches, but nothing that really suited me. So just by luck, I started talking to a friend that I went to church with back in Texas. And I told him, like, hey, I'm having trouble finding a church back in Norway. And he said, well, I think my pastor knows some guy in Europe, maybe possibly in Norway. So I'll ask my pastor and I'll ask him to get back to me. And just by chance, his pastor knew a guy up in North England, Massachusetts area, who also knew a guy who was a missionary in Norway.
Yes.
Who happened to be living in the same city as I did. So it's funny that all it took for me to find a church in Norway was to go through Texas and then back to Norway again.
Yeah, exactly. That's so funny. But I mean, and who was that missionary in Norway that you got connected with?
Yeah, so it's a guy named Zach, which I've spent a lot of time with and got on very close with over the last couple of years. He's an amazing guy. He's been a big mentor in my life, and he really, in some ways, I consider him really a spiritual father.
Yeah, I mean, well, Zach, it's Zach Dove, right? We've had him on the podcast. I mean, he's Cameron's boss with IMB, and I mean, he's a great guy. And so through Zach, who did you meet through Zach? Anyone special? Wink, wink, shove, shove.
Well, so initially I went to the student in Norway. I happened to meet Jacob, and I also think I met Jacob the first time I went. And I was like, oh, well, this is cool. More Americans.
Yeah.
And me having to leave Texas so abruptly, it made me, to some extent, leave some part of me in Texas. So me going back to Norway and being around Americans is something I love, and it's something that...
Well, I mean, that's something that's so close to your heart. I mean, you were born again in the United States. I mean, you just love hanging out. It's true. I'm going to say something about you now. This is just a true thing about Bendik, is that he loves hanging out with Americans. So anytime there's like Americans in town, he loves hanging, and that's awesome. I mean,
I spent so much time in the US that it kind of became a second home away from home. So hanging out with Americans and American missionaries who come to Norway is sort of like, to some extent, even though I don't physically go back to the US, it's part of being home.
Yeah.
So that's really nice. Yeah, and I met Jacob, and he was a good guy. He was a cool guy.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I met you at Zach's house. They do these things on Thursday nights during the school season when they're called student dinners, and it's for students in Oslo. And before we planted our church, I used to go to the student dinners quite a bit, and so I went to the first one that you came to. I think it was the first one that you came to. I was there. And we met, we hung out, we had some things in common, and it's funny because, and this is true, this is actually literally true. Leaving, student dinner, I called Cameron or sent him a text or something like that. I was like, hey, I met this guy. Zach introduced me to this guy named Bendik. He became a Christian in the U.S. He's Norwegian. He's going to plant a church with us. It was the day I met you. I knew you were going to plant a church with us.
Yeah, and at that point, he hadn't told me.
Yeah.
It took, I would say, probably about a year or so before he said, hey, so, I'm going to start a church plant. Would you like to come with us?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was so early. I didn't want to put any pressure on someone I had just met, of course. But, I had a feeling and was like, yeah, Bendik's he seems like a good guy. I mean, I had known him for like 4 hours. So I mean, he seemed like a good guy. And I thought like, he definitely seems like someone I would want to plant a church with. And here we are. Isn't that great? Isn't that crazy? Like 2.5 years. I don't know if you ever feel like how crazy this is, but I feel just the amazing, like, seeing the hand of God work through our lives to make happen the things that, we stepped out in faith to accomplish, like planting a church, moving to Oslo, just your story just on its own.
Absolutely. And there's so many good examples of like God working in mysterious ways. Just like a few examples is that when I moved to Texas, I called my mom and said, hey, there's a lot of religious people here. It's not something I'm used to. And she would say, well, maybe you'll come home and you'll be a Christian. And I was like, oh, yeah, there's no way that's going to happen. But then, I mean, God had already plans. And another example is just me having to go all the way to Texas to find a church in Norway. So it's all those tiny examples of God leading you or giving you directions that it's hard to overlook, but it's amazing when you look back at it.
Well, I mean, gosh, think about all the dots that had to connect, right? So God, you being born again in America, like I said earlier, and God just stealing your heart for the USA. You love Americans, and then having to send you back to Norway under difficult circumstances, connecting you with an American missionary who then connected you with a small group of Americans who came to Norway to plant a church.
Absolutely. And
now you've planted a church with them.
Yeah. And also, like moving back, it was difficult, and I find myself lost at times. But then finding a church the way I did, it just iterated the way that, well, you might not always see it, but God has a plan for you.
Yeah.
Which was an amazing reinsurance.
Yeah, I think the last 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years, is definitely a testament to that in your life. Yeah, probably like the last 7 years. Now that I'm doing my math right.
Oh wow, has it really been that long? Time flies.
Yeah, it's been a little while, man.
And then being part of a new church plant, which is really exciting, because one of the things I enjoyed most of being part of the church in Texas was that it was heavily community focused.
Right.
They put so much focus on living in community that church just wasn't a place where you met up every Sunday and then went your own way. Church was something you did throughout the week. You lived in community, you did life together, and that was such a important aspect for me, so that when Jacob told me that, hey, this is how we plan to do church as well, hey, I was like, yeah, I'm sold. Yeah. I'm totally gonna be in on this with you.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm happy you're in with us. Honestly, like if I had to redo it again, I mean, you definitely would be close to the top of the list.
That's very kind.
If not at the very top of the people, I would be like, yes, I need to ask this. I need to ask you to come.
Really good at building up my ego.
Well, it's sincere. I mean, it's how I felt for a few years, and now it's actually happening, which is crazy. And it's only because of the goodness of God, and I mean the faithfulness you have of following Him where He's leading you, even if it's unexpected and somewhat mysterious.
Yeah, so I love the new church, and I mean, we haven't been going on for that long. It's only been a few months, but I love how close we got on over the last few months, and I can't wait to see what's going to happen in the time to come.
Yeah, me as well. I can't wait to see. Well, Bendik, I mean, thank you so much for today. Thank you for telling your story. Thank you for being so open and bringing up so many thought-provoking things that, I mean, I just get excited hearing about, man. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And for you listening back at home, thank you for listening to Bendik's story and for listening to Word First Radio. And we'll see you again next week. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Word First Radio. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check us out online at wordfirst.us.